Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my quarterback draft strategy for the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, I've used this draft strategy for the last couple seasons, primarily because of the shift that we have seen at the quarterback position, but also within the entire landscape of the National Football League. So I use the following pillars of success in order to determine which quarterbacks I want to have on roster going into my 2024 fantasy football leagues. These three pillars being quarterback mobility in regards to rushing statistics they are capable of accumulating, followed by quarterback consistency, which entails fantasy point production over a sustained volume of time. Now, I'm not talking about performances in which they go ahead and score maybe 13.5 points within a given week. I've gone ahead and created a consistency calculator at the quarterback position, and I've utilized that in order to determine consistency over a spectrum of time. We'll go ahead and discuss that. And the final pillar of success I find to be draft stock. Again, as you approach your 2024 fantasy football drafts, players have different ADPs. A guy like Josh Allen, the number one overall quarterback over 3 of the last 4 seasons, is currently coming off the board via Underdog Fantasy at the back end of the 3rd round, beginning of the 4th round. Based on his overall draft capital, is there value being left on the table, or potentially is he at a discount for our fantasy football teams? We'll go ahead and talk about the draft stock and capital that is utilized for a spectrum of different quarterbacks and whether their overall investment is worth it. And as we approach the 2024 season, when we talk about quarterback draft strategy, I want to go ahead and get a quarterback who ticks all 3 of these boxes. They're mobile, they're consistent, and their overall draft stock and draft capital needed to go ahead and get them on my team is not going to, cost me an arm or a leg. So as we progress throughout today's video, I'll go ahead and present statistics in order to justify all 3 of these pillars so that we can set ourselves up for success as we approach our 2024 fantasy football draft. Before we get into today's content, a reminder, if you haven't yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. If you are looking for daily fantasy football content, this channel is going to provide it this summer and, of course, going into the regular season up until capturing a 2024 fantasy football championship. Additionally, for those of you guys who want more content outside of the channel, you can also go ahead and check out the Patreon. And for those of you who are looking for more statistics in regards to potential quarterback strategies and more, you can go ahead and get your hands on my 2024 fantasy football draft guide via Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you use code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, but you're going to get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, those subsequent rankings. Those rankings will be updated and sent to you every single week so that regardless of when you're drafting over the course of the month of August, you're prepared. Additionally, the emails won't stop there. I'll also send you emails every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18, which includes all rankings at all positions, including half PPR and full PPR. So for those of you who are interested, of course, get your hands on my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, gain an advantage upon your league mates, and of course, help yourself bring home a 2024 fantasy football championship. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility, and of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get into the conversation of this quarterback draft strategy, beginning with the concept of mobility. The potential at which a quarterback is going to gain rushing yards and rushing touchdowns within a given season, and of course, accumulate more fantasy points in doing so. So I've gone ahead and represented the total quarterback rushing statistics accumulated over the course of the last decade of the NFL, 2014 to 2023. Of course, as we can see, there has been a huge uptick of overall opportunities and of course, production within quarterback rushing. I mean, just taking into comparison 2023 to 2014, we have seen an increase of 718 rushing attempts, 3,211 rushing yards, and 67 additional rushing touchdowns. Now, many of you may be thinking, well, Andrew, there has been an addition of a 17th game to the regular season. So if in fact we took all of these statistics and made it a per game average, we have seen a lot of recent success in regards to rushing attempts, yardage, and of course touchdowns. And I went ahead and I put an asterisk next to each of the overall numbers that were top 3 over the course of the last decade within these categories. So of course, 2020, 2022, and 2023 dominating in all of those overall aspects. And like I mentioned earlier, the only reason that this draft strategy has been utilized by myself over the course of the last couple of seasons is primarily because of the shift that we are witnessing within the National Football League and the tendencies for quarterbacks to rush far more than they have within the past. And as you can see in comparison to 2014, 2015, etc. Now, as the rushing overall opportunities have gone up, the overall passing, sustainability and touchdowns, passing yardage, all of those statistics have evidently gone down over the course of the last decade. And I wanted to go ahead and represent that as well, just to give you an understanding as to what we have witnessed over the course of the last decade in terms of overall passing attempts per game, completions per game, passing yardage per game, and passing touchdowns per game, regardless of season. Because again, whether it is a 16 or 17 game season, we wanted to determine which seasons truly found a lot of success. 2020 was still in the conversation for many of these overall circumstances, which primarily has to do with the fact that there were no fans in the stand throughout that season. It was the highest scoring season in NFL history because, again, there was no home field advantage in any circumstance. So, of course, we found incredible stats there. But prior to that, we had a lot of contributions from 2015, 16, and 18, in which they led in a lot of these categories within the quarterback conversation in terms of passing yardage and passing touchdowns. Now, over the course of the 2022 and 2023 seasons, unfortunately, on a per game basis, 17 games within a season, so on a weekly basis, unfortunately, we have seen these numbers go to an all-time low over the course of the last decade. So we are beginning to witness far more rushing upside for our quarterbacks and far less upside in terms of potential passing yardage and touchdowns. Therefore, in order to succeed, we need to adapt to the environment that we are currently in as we approach the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, many of you may be hesitant to draft a quarterback that has a high level of mobility because of potential injury risk. But right in front of us, right before our very eyes, we are watching the National Football League change, and we are beginning to see that the rushing upside of these quarterbacks truly is where the value is found in terms of fantasy success going forward. I mean, just looking at last season, Jalen Hurts, 40% of his overall fantasy points that he scored was from rushing statistics. Just putting that into perspective, the entire league has changed, and it's not changing back anytime soon. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the value of rushing statistics. Besides, 1 point for every 10 rushing yards, the difference for a quarterback is the 2 extra points that they are getting in comparison from a passing touchdown to a rushing touchdown. Now, while we're on the topic of mobility, I've gone ahead over the last couple seasons and determined what I find to be a quote-unquote mobile quarterback. My designation revolves around the idea of a quarterback surpassing 265 rushing yards within a given season. Now, you could go ahead and take it a step further for quarterbacks who don't play a full 17-game season or 16-game season and talk about averaging, 15.5 rushing yards per game. But for this purpose, let's go ahead and let's just talk about 265 or more rushing yards within a given year. Over the course of the last 5 seasons, 2019 to 2023, the seasons in which we have seen the most capable and accomplished rushing quarterbacks, in NFL history, we have witnessed over the course of the last 5 seasons, 51 different quarterbacks surpassing 265 rushing yards within their given year. In those seasons, those quarterbacks were averaging 5 touchdowns per game. So not only are you getting the contribution from a mobile quarterback of 26.5 fantasy points just off of yardage, you're getting an additional 30 fantasy points on average in terms of rushing touchdowns. So that's 56.5 fantasy points for quarterbacks who just barely meet the designation. Now, if we take it a step further, going to 300, 400, 500 plus rushing yards within a given season, yes, the volume of players who are capable of accomplishing this dwindles quite fast, to be honest, because again, there are not very many quarterbacks in the National Football League who can sustain a high volume of rushing attempts and of course yardage, but there's also not very many that are athletic enough in order to accumulate this high of a volume of yardage. Therefore, in this conversation, as you see, the players go down, but the rushing touchdowns per season continue to go up. If we talk about Jalen Hurts' overall production last season, I talked about earlier, 40% of his overall year was from rushing statistics. He scored 150 fantasy points just off of rushing statistics of yardage and touchdowns last season. So now that we've quantified the value of a mobile quarterback and their potential going into 2024 based on the last 5 seasons, we want to talk about what this value means in comparison to quarterbacks who aren't as capable within the rushing category. When we compare, for example, 265 rushing yards to the quarterback position, that could either be, in terms of 26.5 fantasy points, an additional 6.6 passing touchdowns for a quarterback, or an additional 662 passing yards for a quarterback. But once you take into account the rushing touchdown averages of 56 plus fantasy points, that is the equivalent of a non-mobile quarterback being able to accumulate an additional 14 passing touchdowns or an additional 1,400 passing yards. that should just give you an understanding as to the kind of advantages that mobile quarterbacks are garnering with their rushing ability for fantasy purposes. In comparison to quarterbacks who are just not, even equipped with the ability to garner this much yardage on the ground, and obviously still can't keep up in terms of the passing game. I mean, the quarterbacks that I think of are like Tua Tagovailoa and, of course, Aaron Rodgers. Guys that are going to be pocket quarterbacks. Kirk Cousins, coming off the Achilles, may not be as mobile. The question is, how do those quarterbacks who are pocket steady and are only going to find production through passing yardage alone? And yes, they're going to have a couple sprinkles of a quarterback sneak for a rushing touchdown, maybe a couple scrambles here and there over the course of a season, but predominantly 95% of their overall production in terms of fantasy points is going to come from passing statistics. So the question is, how do those quarterbacks compete with those that are continuing to garner a boatload of value based off rushing statistics alone? And when I looked at the last 5 seasons of fantasy football, 57% of the top 12 quarterbacks were quarterbacks that can be given the mobile designation within a given year. To be exact, that's 34 of the last 60 QB1s. Now, again, that leaves up a lot of room for quarterbacks who were not mobile within their given season, but still ranked within the top 12 over the course of the last 5 seasons. I found that those quarterbacks had to average 4,500 passing yards and 32 passing touchdowns within their given season to become a top 12 ranked quarterback. So again, if I'm going to trust a quarterback to have 4,500 yards and 32 passing touchdowns within a given year, there are very few in the National Football League that I can trust going into 2024 who are capable of accomplishing that if they're not going to have, mobility. And you know what the funny thing is? There are probably just as many quarterbacks who are mobile and that are going to gather themselves 300 plus rushing yards this season that are also going to have themselves 4,500 passing yards and 30 plus touchdowns in comparison to the pocket quarterbacks who are only going to find their overall upside within passing statistics. The final thing I wanted to mention in regards to quarterback mobility is the top 12 quarterbacks currently in terms of ADP. As you can see on screen, amongst the top 12 quarterbacks going into 2024 based on ADP alone, 10 of these 12 quarterbacks will have the mobile designation in 2024. Being, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Mahomes, Jackson, Richardson, Murray, Burrow, Prescott, Love, and Daniels. All of them have the capability and most likely will surpass 265 rushing yards within the given year. And of course, get the additional value that they're going to be able to gather with the potential of rushing touchdowns within the upcoming season. And that isn't by accident. Again, CJ Stroud has the ability to find himself, rushing success, but obviously he did not go that way in his rookie season and most likely will not go in that direction this upcoming season. Brock Purdy, yes, he has some wheels. He can make some plays if he's out of the pocket, but ultimately he is not a running quarterback in comparison to the rest of the field that finds far more success within that overall conversation. Of course, we know that the peak of success in regards to this overall potential is Lamar Jackson. Guys like Anthony Richardson, even, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, who are all capable of accumulating 700 plus rushing yards within a given season. And then the rest follow as such. Joe Burrows and Patrick Mahomes, both capable of 300 rushing yards within a year. We have the Dak Prescotts of the world, along with Jordan Love. Jaden Daniels, who I haven't even mentioned, he could very easily also have himself a season very similar to Kyler Murray, in which he's able to, accumulate 550 to 600 rushing yards in 2024. But again, this isn't by accident. The league is changing. We are seeing that college football is truly bringing in influences, and the athleticism of these quarterbacks that are being drafted are at an all-time high. So you want to go ahead and continue to invest in these players who are capable of elevating their game. Now, sure, many of you may be hesitant to draft one of these quarterbacks because of the potential of, yes, more rushing upside, but also more injury upside. And I agree that there's a possibility that that could take place. But when we talk about injuries in the National Football League, last season, there were 66 different quarterbacks that started a game. In fact, last season in 2023, not only was it the second most quarterbacks to start within a single season, it was the most rookie quarterbacks that have ever started in a single season, breaking the record, which was, I think it was 10 last season. Pretty crazy. The 2022 season still holds the record for the most unique quarterbacks started within a given season, 68. So again, there's been a lot of injuries to quarterbacks over the last couple seasons, regardless of whether they're mobile, making plays out of the pocket, etc. So again, don't let injuries scare you off too greatly going into 2024. Now, besides, injuries and maybe staying healthy, being a form of consistency, when I talk about the potential of consistency, I'm not referring to staying healthy. I'm referring to fantasy point production as our next pillar of success in regards to valuing quarterbacks going into the 2024 fantasy football drafts. Now, when I introduce this metric of consistency, I'm talking about the base minimum of being a quarterback one over the course of the last 3 seasons. For example, in 2023, throughout the 18 weeks, in every single week, there was a 12th ranked quarterback based on total fantasy points scored. Those quarterbacks on average last season scored 17.7 fantasy points. So when you take that as a baseline average, and then you additionally take the baseline averages from 2021 and 2022 and combine it, you get an understanding as to what the base production in terms of a happy performance from our quarterbacks should look like going into a given week. Because if you're playing in a 12-team league and you don't have at base minimum the 12th ranked quarterback within a given week of overall production, unfortunately, you weren't taking the full advantage of the potential within that given week. Therefore, unfortunately, we're a little bit screwed in those scenarios, but we're trying to find quarterbacks who can consistently find themselves within the top 12 quarterback standing based on their fantasy point production within given weeks. So what I've gone ahead and done over the course of the last couple seasons is create a consistency calculator for fantasy production at the quarterback position. Now, I go into a full expansion of these details in my 2024 fantasy football draft guide. Again, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy, use code Andrew. And of course, get that draft guide prior to your 2024 fantasy football draft so you can have, of course, all of the information in there along with rankings so you can set yourself up for success. For those of you who have already used a first-time deposit and of course my code in the past, you can also check out Patreon. All of this content is also on there. So in regards to this consistency calculator, the baseline performance of being the number 12th ranked quarterback over the course of the last 3 seasons for fantasy football counts as one singular point. So as you can see, we don't have very many quarterbacks over the course of the last 3 seasons that have been able to sustain a consistency score over 1.0. Now, when we look at the numbers to the right side of the screen, of course, we have guys like Josh Allen at 1.53. I mean, making himself very much known as the most dependable and consistent quarterback over the course of the last 3 seasons. Jalen Hurts, 1.48. And then there's a pretty steep drop-off from there. Of course, Patrick Mahomes' 2023 efforts did not help his overall consistency. But in comparison to the rest of the league, I mean, Anthony Richardson, again, he doesn't have a huge volume of games that he has played, but in the games in which he has been consistent. Kyler Murray, the thumbnail of today's episode, very much so, not only a mobile quarterback, but also one that is, quite frankly, consistent. We're beginning to see a trend here. A lot of these, positive scored quarterbacks that are over 1.0 have a mobile designation. They have the ability to surpass 265 rushing yards within an upcoming season. Followed by, Justin Herbert, who has done that in the past. Kirk Cousins, unfortunately, has not been able to do so. Neither is Brock Purdy. Justin Fields, a mobile quarterback. And, of course, Aaron Rodgers. And it doesn't stop there. I've gone ahead and tracked the rest of these guaranteed starting quarterbacks going into this upcoming season, just to give you an understanding as to what kind of consistency they have based on my overall calculator. Now, in many of these scenarios, I've given players the benefit of the doubt. Like Jared Goff, I only utilized the last 2 seasons of his overall production to find the 0.78 consistency. I didn't even count the year of 2021. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I said, listen, he's played extremely well in 2022 and 2023. I don't want to, slug down his score because of what he did back in 2021. Same thing with guys like Trevor Lawrence. I didn't want to, bog down their overall potential for success based on what he did with the Urban Meyer era of the Jacksonville Jaguars, his rookie season, which was an absolute disaster. I also didn't want to include, anything that Tua Tagovailoa did, back in 2021. Again, I thought that would bog down his potential. Same thing with Baker Mayfield. I only utilized last season's overall numbers in terms of determining his consistency. Nonetheless, I've given a lot of the players on both of these screens the benefit of the doubt in order to determine what kind of consistency they have going into this upcoming season. So now that we've discussed both mobility and consistency at the quarterback position, the final pillar for potential success revolves around draft stock. So I want to go ahead and introduce the conversation of drop-off in production. This is something that I've talked about ad nauseum in the past, prior seasons videos throughout the offseason. And I once again reintroduce the idea of drop-off in production. Drop-off in production, especially as it currently stands on screen, is the total averages for the number 1 through 12th ranked quarterbacks between 2021 and 2023. Therefore, the last 3 number 1 overall quarterbacks in fantasy football, twice being Josh Allen and once being Patrick Mahomes, on a total averaged 403.87 fantasy points per game in a 4-point per passing touchdown league over the course of the last 3 seasons. So once you take into account the top 12, we get an idea as to what we could potentially anticipate to see going into 2024 for our potential number 1 overall ranked quarterback by the end of the season. And the reason why I want to present this is because it really does give you an understanding as to, the potential that you could gather with a specific draft pick. If you are going to draft one of the top 3 quarterbacks, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, going into this upcoming season, you're going to have to use at base minimum 4th round draft capital. Their current ADPs via Underdog, like I showed earlier, is 37.5 through 45.4. So if you're going to utilize a 4th round draft selection on one of these quarterbacks, who all 3 are very much so capable of finishing as the number 1 overall ranked quarterback, there is a potential in which you could gather yourself when we separate the number 1 overall ranked player to the number 8th overall ranked player, a difference of over 100 fantasy points. The positional advantage that you are gathering for yourself with the 4th round draft capital is significant. I mean, when we talk about the quarterback position over the course of the last 20 years plus, I mean, I'm talking about 2002 to 2019. Throughout those 18 seasons, we saw 16 different quarterback performances that accumulated over 350 fantasy points. From 2020 to 2023, the last 4 seasons, we have also seen 16 performances of over 350 fantasy points. Like I've mentioned earlier, we need to adapt to the current age of fantasy football. And in this current circumstance, we are in the most successful age of elite fantasy quarterbacks within the top 5 of the conversation. I mean, just looking at, specifically the top 4 of this drop-off in production, it is very apparent that there is a steep decline after the top 4. There is a reason why we have guys like Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, and Lamar Jackson, because we know that they're capable of accomplishing these high-value numbers, which of course is the reason why they're being drafted within the 4th round at a base minimum. So as you approach your 2024 fantasy football draft in regards to draft stock, understand that already, first and foremost, you're getting a discount at these top tier quarterbacks, especially the top 4, primarily because this time last season, the overall ADP of a Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes required you to select them at the back end of the 2nd round or the beginning of the 3rd round. We are literally being given a full round discount on value at these top tier quarterback positions that have so much upside, especially considering that they have all been in the top tier conversation of consistency and mobility over the course of the last couple seasons. It makes me extremely confident in selecting them and using my draft capital, even though it is a 4th round or 5th round selection. Even though this is a high valued pick, I still feel very confident because of the positional advantage I am gaining in terms of fantasy points, which again could look between 60 to 80 fantasy points depending on who you select. Now, for example, if you're in the market of not drafting a quarterback within the 4th or 5th rounds and you want to go ahead and wait and go ahead and allow your team to build an advantage at running back, wide receiver, and tight end going into 2024, I have no problem with that overall approach. I believe that you can continue to find value across the draft board in later rounds. Now, as the rounds progress, we get to guys like CJ Stroud in terms of overall ADP. Yes, this is a player that last season wasn't at the overall peak of consistency that we want him to be at. But again, he was a rookie. Continuing on to the idea that he is not a mobile quarterback, these are things that kind of shy me away from the potential of a CJ Stroud. Sure, he is capable of accumulating 4,500 passing yards and 32 plus passing touchdowns, like I mentioned earlier, the base minimum average that you need to be able to compete within the top 12 conversation going into, the 2024 season, obviously based on the averages of quarterbacks over the course of the last 5 seasons that have been able to accomplish this. But yes, he's capable of accomplishing that, but do I want to make the selection and use the draft capital on him? I ask myself in this situation, is the investment worth it? And when we talk about the drop-off in production and the fact that even if CJ Stroud finishes the number 5 overall quarterback, yes, there is a potential in which he can surpass 318 fantasy points, but in the overall kind of system that we have seen build over the course of the last decade of fantasy football, and specifically in terms of drop-off in production over the course of the last 3 seasons, 2021 to 2023, I don't think that the overall investment is worth it. I'd rather go ahead and wait for another quarterback that could very easily be a top 5 player, if not the number 6 or 7th overall ranked quarterbacks, such as players like Joe Burrow or Jordan Love. I mean, Burrow's current ADP via Underdog Fantasy, 90.5. Jordan Love, 97.1. Dak Prescott is also in there. I think he's at like 94. Pretty ridiculous numbers by quarterbacks that have already demonstrated consistency over the course of their seasons, and additionally have the ability to get extra fantasy points with their mobility and rushing statistics. Or you can wait even longer, and instead of taking potentially someone like CJ Stroud, just get Brock Purdy because he's being slept on pretty aggressively based on what he is potentially capable of producing in terms of passing yardage and passing touchdowns in comparison to a prior selection like a CJ Stroud. So as it currently stands, again, I don't mind the idea of waiting for a quarterback, but I'm also still looking for quarterbacks that have the mobility and consistency upside that we have witnessed over the course of the last couple of seasons to continue into 2024, rather than investing into a quarterback that is going to be a pocket passer and is not going to be as potentially fulfilling of a pick based on potential fantasy upside in comparison to the rest of the field. All right, that covers it in regards to my quarterback draft strategy. I want to thank you guys for watching. Again, these are the 3 pillars of success that I follow in terms of quarterback draft strategy going into 2024. Hopefully all the statistics and data that I presented to you guys give you guys more confidence in making quarterback selections in your 2024 fantasy football drafts. Players that are going to make an impact and help you capture a 2024 fantasy football championship. And of course, make the most informed decisions during your 2024 fantasy drafts. All right, thank you everybody for watching. Be sure to subscribe. Of course, use code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.